Hello, and welcome to Lecture 5, Part 3 on Cinematography. And here in our first slide, we have a still from Gravity, directed by Alfonso Cuarón, and Cinematography by Emmanuel Lubezki. And Lubezki is one of the most prominent cinematographers working today. He's made a lot of big films for a lot of big directors. And the films he has shot include Gravity, Birdman, and The Revenant, and all three of those films won him Oscars 3 years in a row, so that was a record. Quite an impressive achievement. And he does very original, distinctive, beautiful work. And if you are interested in checking out his work, I have linked this short video giving you an idea of some of it to the course site under clips. So check it out. Okay, let's move on with our discussion of concepts. Let's talk a little bit about perspective, right? Everything that we see in life is a matter of perspective, whether through our eye or the perspective that is captured in a film. So objects diminish by a simple systematic rule. Closer objects look larger, and farther objects look smaller, even if they are of uniform size. Obviously, we recognize this every night when we look up at the moon. The optical system of your eye, registering light rays reflected from a given scene, supplies a host of information about scale, depth, and spatial relations among parts. Such relations are called perspective relations, and they are how we make sense of and navigate and negotiate our world. So, what does it have to do with film? Well, the lens of a photographic camera does roughly what your eye does. It does the same thing, right? It gathers light from a scene, and it transmits that light into the flat surface of the film to form an image that represents size, depth, and other dimension of the scene. And in doing so, it creates perspective. And I'm sure you know where we're going with this. Perspective, like anything else, can be controlled and manipulated by the filmmaker. The focal length of the lens alters the perceived magnification, depth, and scale of things in the image. And we usually distinguish three sorts of lenses based on their effects on perspective. The short focal length or wide angle lens, the middle focal length or the normal lens, which is by far the most common, and the long focal length or telephoto lens. So, in 35mm photography, or cinematography, which is the standard for shooting feature films, a lens of less than 35mm in focal length is considered a wide-angle lens. And that tends to distort straight lines near the edges of the frame, bulging them outwards. The wide-angle lens also exaggerates depth, because distances between foreground and background seem greater. So the lens makes figures moving towards the camera seem to cover more ground. And here are some examples of wide-angle shots. And as soon as you see them, you know what I'm talking about, because we've all seen many shots like this, where the sides of the frame appear to be kind of squeezed, right? And then the middle of the frame is sort of popping out towards us. So a normal lens, a lens of medium focal length, is 35 to 50mm and seeks to avoid noticeable perspective distortion. With the normal lens, horizontal and vertical lines are rendered straight and perpendicular. Parallel lines should recede to distant vanishing points, and foreground and background should seem neither squeezed apart or squashed together. And here's an example of a normal shot from Hustlers. And normal shot is, as I said, the most common shot used. And the reason why is because The purpose of narrative film is to create a sense of continuity, to create a sense that we are immersed in a film and that we are not taken out of the film by anything out of the ordinary that draws our attention to the filmmaking. A wide-angle shot tends to do that, right? We're like, whoa, what's going on here? And whereas it might have its place because it's being used by the filmmaker to convey something specific, the normal shot keeps us rooted in the story of the film without thinking about the filmmaking. So it's part of continuity filmmaking. And one final example of a lens is the telephoto lens. And whereas wide-angle lenses distort space laterally, longer lenses flatten the space along the camera axis. So cues for depth and volume are reduced, and the planes seem squashed together as when you look through a telescope or binoculars. A long focal length also affects subject movement. Because it flattens depth, the figure moving towards the camera takes more time to cover what seems to be a small distance. So it allows the filmmakers to manipulate a sense of movement. So here is an example of a shot from a telephoto lens. I can't play it within the lecture, but I suggest that you watch it. It's only a couple of seconds long. It's linked to the lesson. But you can even see by looking at it how those squashed planes create an effect, because it looks like the plane is almost about to run them over, right? When in reality, it's down the runway a bit and they're fine. But so what's the purpose of a shot like that? Well, it lends a sense of danger, right? That even though they're sort of technically fine, the reality is that they're in danger, and the plane coming at them and looming so close conveys an idea of that. And then we have the zoom lens. And the zoom is often used to substitute for the camera moving backward or forward. Although the zoom shot presents a mobile framing, the camera remains fixed while the zoom increases or decreases the focal length. So I'm sure we are all familiar with what a zoom shot looks like, because it's a shot that really calls attention to itself as the camera zooms right into the face of the subject, or whatever the close-up is. And I'm sure we've all used those too, or at least most of us have, on our phones, where instead of walking towards our subject to get closer, we just squeeze the camera or whatever so that the lens zooms right up in on the subject. Okay, depth of field. Now, depth of field is a really important element of filmmaking because focus is such an integral element of cinematography. In other words, what's going to be in focus in our shot? So depth of field is the measurement of the closest and the furthest planes in front of a camera lens, between which everything will be in sharp focus. And we talked about this when we talked about composition in our lesson on mise-en-scène, right? That there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. And those are the planes that we're using to create our sense of depth. And we can further create a sense of depth, or we can further direct our viewer's attention by blurring out the background, by blurring out the foreground, etc. So a very basic example of that here. In our first shot, the background's almost completely blurred out, whereas the foreground object is completely in focus. In our second shot, the background comes more into focus, but it's still a little blurry, right? Our attention is still being directed to the foreground object, and in the last shot, everything's in focus. This is what's called deep focus. And again, it's all about the filmmaker directing your attention. So obviously with the first shot, the idea is that we're supposed to look at the bottle. Um, but in the third shot, the director might be saying, I want you to look everywhere in the screen. I want you to look to see if something's going to come from off screen. I want you to look and see if there's any pertinent details. I want you to make up your mind about what's important in the shot. So, again, it's all about choices that convey meaning. Here are a couple of examples of shots from my own camera. I like playing with depth of field because the new iPhones make it so easy. So on the left side we have my dog, in the middle we have my coffee, and on the right side we have my girlfriend. And I think you could sum these up as the three most important things in my life. So deep focus cinematography. We talked about it just a second ago with the bottle and the background and the middle plane all being completely in focus, right? In Hollywood during the 1940s, it became sort of more in vogue due to the influence of Citizen Kane. Filmmakers began using faster film, shorter focal lengths, and more intense lighting to yield that greater depth of field so that the audience could see everything all at once. Because deep focus, as we said, keeps objects in both close and distant planes sharp, often indicating that everything in the shot is of equal significance, or, as I said, maybe the filmmaker just wants you to do the work of determining what is significant, right? It's a way of asking you to pay closer attention to what's going on. We actually had an example of a deep focus shot from Citizen Kane in the lesson on mise-en-scène and composition. Now here's a whole scene. Again, I can't play it and record and narrate my lecture at the same time, but I do want you to either stop the lecture and go watch the clip, or watch the clip when you are finished with the lecture. And so what Orson Welles, who directed Kane, became a master of and became famous for was not only deep focus, where you could see everything in the frame in each plane, like you can here, right? You've got the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, but also in tandem with the moving camera. So he liked to move the camera rather than cut to give a sense of constant movement throughout the scene. And then, of course, shallow focus, just one more example here, right? What's important. Okay, so that is the end of this lecture, and we have one more to go on cinematography.